So, what are your first memories of interacting when, or around about the time you're 10 years old, Lawndale starts to transition from being a mostly Jewish neighborhood to about half African American and Jewish. What is happening as this neighborhood transitions? And I know you stayed there through the entire transition period, but what are the beginning effects? What can you see on the ground in the neighborhood there that affected you later in life and at the time?
Well, as blacks were starting to move in, there were whites there who started to move out because of that. As far as the elementary school, Austin Elementary, which I went to, and John Marshall High School, they were integrated at the beginning, at the start, but as the neighborhood was becoming more African American, and they talk about a certain percentage or tipping point, whites started to move out, and unlike African Americans who were very limited as to where they could move, the whites that were living in Lawndale had more flexibility. They could go to Skokie or various other suburban areas, which African Americans could not do. And so the schools like Lawson and Marshall that were integrated to some extent and so forth, became eventually, as time went on, predominantly African American because of the fact, again, of white family. The ones that were our neighbors and that we lived with and so forth, many of them started to move out.
So the ethnic siloing in the neighborhood created an ethnic silo within the education system as well?
Yes. When Marshall and Lawson were getting a greater percentage of black students, the black students didn't see anyone there in terms of the teachers or administration or other people in administration that looked like them. And this, of course, later on, as we go on into the 60s, would lead to demands for Black history classes and for black teachers and for a principal. In other words, if a certain student demographic now was a predominant one, they felt that should be reflected in what was going on around the school. It wasn't a case where they wanted anyone who was white to go out. They just wanted a reflection among the teachers, the leaders, the administration, and so forth, to reflect the fact that they are there as students as well.
Did this experience of watching this happen and being a participant in the neighborhood and in the education system, does that later affect you as a teacher?
And in what sense are you?
Well, you were already talking about when you were younger, you were noticing the inequities within the education system and the demands from some of the black students for recognition and representation within their teachers. And then later you become a teacher in the inner city yourself. Mm-hmm. And did any of your childhood experiences going to Chicago public schools in this period of transition, does it affect your teaching style and the way you viewed educational equity?
Okay, it didn't affect me negatively. It affected me in very affirmative ways. As far as my family, my parents were concerned and so forth, they emphasized to me that everyone is equal. I was able to bring my black friends from school and so forth into the house for parties or birthday celebrations or various occasions. A lot of the black children I read stories to and so on. So this wasn't some unnatural phenomenon or anything to me. I felt as comfortable around these students as I felt as comfortable among other students who were Jewish or whatever religion or whatever ethnic background they happen to be. And I think, again, my parents, my family background, my experiences helped to reinforce that type of feeling that where is everyone going? I don't see what the problem is. And I do know, for example, when I was at Farragut.
Farragut's a high school in Chicago, right?
High school in Chicago, 2345 South Christiana Avenue. Still remember the address. There were teachers there who definitely loathed the students who were going there. Some of them complained because they were there when it was a predominantly white high school, and now all of a sudden all of these black students are coming in, and they don't like the changes that are taking place because of that.
One quick thing I'd like to mention, ask you. This conflict that you're saying is happening at Farragut of teachers that didn't like the change. What do you remember let's go back to the neighborhood, back to Lawndale. What do you remember of this transition? You say your family and you were very accepting of the change, but was that typical or atypical?
I would say it was atypical.
And so what was some of the things that were going on in the neighborhood during this racial transition?
Well, all the stereotypes here about the housing is going to, is going to go.
Housing values.
They're going to go down and so forth. You're going to have a lot of crime situations going on. There's going to be a lot of trash and garbage and, all of the stereotype things that you hear about what happens to neighborhoods when African Americans move in. And I heard a lot. I heard a lot of this even from some of my relatives and so forth, who were saying, "Well, we worked hard, we did this and so forth. Why can't they do the same type of thing?" And then of course the welfare issue and all of these other stereotypes. Ronald Reagan's use of
Cadillac driving welfare queen.
Welfare queens and so on. These were all secret type of, well, not so secret type of code words maybe, about the fact that they just didn't like the idea of the changes that were going on and were not willing to adapt or adjust or give the people a chance to see if the stereotypes that they believed in would actually happen.
And so was this similar to what was happening at Farragut in the school within the teachers and the
Yeah,
administration?
I believe usually what happens outside of the school ends up being reflected inside the school as well. And going back to the teachers at Farragut, some of them that I had to tolerate or work with to my dismay, they really believe that these students, and I won't do that. They didn't believe that these students had ability, that they were not interested in education. They saw them in very negative ways. And I'll give you one particular example. And I think I mentioned this to you before. We had counselors, white counselors at the school. We didn't have any black counselors at all. That wouldn't change till later on. But when white students would come in, those who were seniors, and they wanted to go to University of Chicago or Northwestern University or Princeton or some other college outside of the state of Illinois, they were encouraged and they were helped and so forth. When an African American student would go into some of these white counselors, they would say, and they expressed the belief that they would like to go to similar type of colleges that white students were going to. The counselor would say, "Well, I don't think you're ready for that," or "Why don't you think about maybe a vocational school, rather than going to Northwestern or one of these other colleges."
So they were hiding their racism within concern for the student, right?
Yeah, well, not really doing a very good job of doing that. I mean, if you put two and two together,
Yeah, you can
when it comes
read
out
between
to,
the lines.
Yeah, read between the lines. Yes.
So, as the neighborhood is transitioning, when did you move out of Lawndale?
Well, the only reason why we did move out, we were one of the last families to move out. Was
The last Jewish families to move out.
All right, one of the last Jews. I don't know if everyone was Jewish. There were other whites there who were not Jewish, who I'm sure also moved out as well. But what happened was my father died. And it was just too much of an emotional and psychological burden for my mother to spend so many years in a certain house at a certain place with my father, and now he wasn't there anymore on a day-to-day basis. So I didn't want that to, it was hurting her very emotionally and so on. In fact, she struggled with depression from time to time as well. as an end result of that. So it so happens that one of her brothers lived on the north side of Chicago, and therefore, when he realized what had happened and what my mother was going with her, what his sister was going through, and so on, they found out that there was an apartment that was open, and so we moved to the north side because of that reason. Otherwise, I mean, if it would have been me myself, I would have stuck it out. I would have stayed there.
What year did you move out? Approximate's fine.
Somewhere in the early 1960s.
Okay.
Yeah.
In the early 1960s. That brings us up to when Dr. King comes to Lawndale, 1963, protesting housing conditions. Did you watch the neighborhood deteriorate? Do you feel that it was intentional on the part of landowners and landlords to subdivide these buildings and overcrowd it and not maintain them?
What was maybe 4 rooms, they ended up slicing up into 6 rooms or things of that sort. Yeah, that certainly did happen. The house or the apartment that the King family moved into when he was here in Chicago, this was I think around
63.
67 or
I think it was earlier.
no, I think it was a little bit late. Well, all right. At any rate, it was in vast disrepair, and therefore, when the landlord found out that Dr. King and his family was going to move in there, he post haste made sure that all the improvements and so forth were made there because of that fact. But talking in general,
66.
yeah, 66. Talking in general here, that always happens. When a school becomes predominantly black or predominantly Hispanic or whatever the case may be, the Board of Education, all of a sudden, the Chicago Board of Education, I'm sure this is true of other cities as well, all of a sudden loses interest and really doesn't take seriously the problems that are going on there and so forth, and are just making the conclusion, well, why pour money down a rat hole or a toilet and so forth? Nothing's going to happen there. They're not going to make good use of it. The kids don't want to learn there. They just want to join gangs and do this, that, and the other thing. And the same thing with housing. The landlords there manipulated, and certainly we're not going to give the same type of services to those apartments that they were slicing up into so many different pieces.
The banks wouldn't give loans.
And the banks wouldn't give loans as well. And of course, you had, I think you had at that time, what was called restrictive covenants, where there was an agreement between a person who was going to sell their house or move out and so forth with the landlord or the mortgage holder or whatever, that you weren't to sell or rent an apartment to someone who was a non-white and so on. So I'm sure a lot of that went on as well.
So you're seeing a direct link between the inequities of housing and the inequities of education.
And education, and not even in just, not only those 2 particular areas, but other areas as well. I mean, when you talk about racism, you're talking about structural racism. I mean, the legal system, for example, and other types of systems are, even religious institutions too, for that matter. You can't exempt them.
Yeah, I think sometimes it even goes beyond that and just into class. Because if you look at Uptown and the education in Uptown, where you had all the migrants from Appalachia who'd moved into the north side, the Chicago Board of Education abandons them pretty much too. All right. So did you pay attention to when Dr. King was in Lawndale? It was your old neighborhood, your home neighborhood. It means a lot to you today. I mean, I know you now. We're what, 60 years removed from then? Mm-hmm. And you still speak of Lawndale with fondness.
Well, when I was teaching at Farragut and so forth, I used to wander around the community in the neighborhood, and I would go to local functions and things there. And you want to know something? There were students there who knew me. I mean, I always would walk to the elder at the end, sometimes late at getting out of Farragut, 4 o'clock, 4:30 or something of that sort. They always greeted me and so forth. They knew me. And there were even instances where they protected me as well, looked out for me as well.
I've had that too. I've had students protect me in the neighborhood from things that were going on, my own students. And yeah, it's kind of
But I can also understand too, looking at it from another point of view, to be the only black person with a sea of white, for example, you feel uncomfortable. You wonder, how are they going to treat me? What are they going to say? What's going to happen? What's going to go on? You have this interior pressure that is building up because of that. I know what that feeling could be because I had that too when I would go to various educational functions or award programs and so forth within the Lawndale area where everyone there primarily or almost was black and so forth. But I never had anyone tell me, what are you doing here? Or get out of here or whatever. They treated me much better than I'm sure if I were black and that was predominantly white, that wouldn't happen.
Yeah, I've had very similar experiences myself as a teacher. So when do you go to college? When do you start deciding, when do you decide to become a teacher? What point in your life is that?
Well, when I was growing up, first I thought I was going to be an entertainer.
Well, vaudeville was still active.
Well, there was a radio television personality at that particular time. His name was Arthur Godfrey, and then this was the 1950s we were talking about and so forth. I thought that's how I wanted to be. I wanted to emulate him, have that type of program where I bring in guests and entertain and so forth and so on. Then I went from that to say, well, maybe I want to become a professional baseball player. The lovable Cubs, lovable losing Cubs. But then I was playing a game of ball and I got conked on the head by the ball. I said, no, I think I'll change my mind. This isn't for me either. But at Marshall High School.
John Marshall?
John Marshall High School. John Marshall, of course, named after the great Supreme Court Justice as well. But at John Marshall High School, there was a history teacher there. Mrs. Saunders was her name. Bless her soul. She had a hard time controlling the class. And students knew never to sit in the front rows because when she would get all wild and so forth, a lot of spit would go out with her. She would lose control, and you would get a shower. So you knew to stay away in the first row there. But she knew her history, and I really got a love of history from her. And she was the one. And she was the one who convinced me, because I liked history so much, why not consider the possibility when you go to college of becoming a history teacher?
And?
Because I got a lot of A's and so forth too. I mean, I did a lot of extra work. I just love doing this. But wait, before we get to the end. And there was also another history teacher at Marshall, a gentleman. I forget his name now, I'm sorry to say. But we would also have a lot of historical talks and discussions and so on outside of class. And he would walk me, or I would walk him, I don't know, to the L and so on, and we would talk about history there. Then we had an old, bitty, nosy art teacher. And I don't know her name, and I don't want to know her name again anyways. But she felt that this was a bad idea. And she went to the teacher, who I had these talks and discussions with, and saying, you can't do this. If you get this friendly with the student, you're not going to be able to honestly evaluate him. And that's a lot of, what.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, we now know that education works better when we feel that we're together in a community.
That's right.
Instead of standing apart and above our students.
But at any rate, because of her interference in this, the discussion stopped.
But you came back to it. You still became a history teacher.
Yeah.
So
that didn't stop.
when you graduated high school, did you go straight to college, or?
Yeah, I went to Roosevelt University.
Was it Roosevelt College still, or was it a university?
No, at that time it was university. I think when it first started, when Eleanor Roosevelt came after her husband died in 1946, it was called Roosevelt College then, and eventually became Roosevelt University. It was the type of place I wanted to go to because it was open-minded, it was liberal, and there were professors there who weren't, extremely Republican or extremely conservative or whatever.
They were open to learning.
They were open to learning, which one of my heroes is John Dewey, learning by doing, experiential learning. To my way of thinking, rather than giving someone a test, if a student can apply the concepts that he or she is learning in the classroom to his or her own life, and to the people around him, and to his family, and to the wider community, then he knows it. He learned it. He knows what it's all about, and so forth. He doesn't have to be given any boring, long-winded test, whether it's SAT or class test or examination or whatever. He or she knows it, and they can apply it. And that's really education. That's real education. And dealing with the real world, not something that someone is never going to be able to use or has no relationship to his or her own world and to his or her own experiences. So Dewey...
Dewey was one of your first role models as a teacher?
One of the first role models, yes.
Who else influenced you as a teacher, since we're here?
Well, all right, I mentioned the two teachers at Farragut. I think those were, at least, those are the ones that come to mind for the most part.
And just so it's on the recording now, how long were you a teacher? We'll come back to where we left off, but just tell us, how long were you a professional teacher?
I started at, and of course, before I passed the Board of Education exam, I like to call it the interrogation. First of all, there was a written examination that you have to take in your field. And then it was recorded. There would be 4 or 5 people, and they would ask you all kinds of questions and so forth. And if you passed both aspects of that, then you would be available to teach on a full-time basis and could apply to schools.
Did Chicago still have the morality test for teachers when you were?
It was more not so much a morality test. It was the patriotic. That you wouldn't join the Communist Party or some nonsense.
It was McCarthyism.
McCarthyism, we're talking about the 50s. Okay, and I lost the trend of thought.
Oh, so then we were going to go back to, you're in college now, and so you're...
Sorry, can you actually answer the
Yeah, I
original
forgot what it
question?
was.
How long were you a teacher?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Sorry,
Yeah,
thank
yeah.
you.
All right.
I myself had lost where we were.
When I get... I better not say what the but when I get involved in this, I go on, all right. And, I'm sure you'll edit it out anyways. I was at Farragut. I think I started at Farragut 63 or 64. And I retired as a full-time teacher from Farragut at 2007.
And you still continue to teach today.
But I've been a substitute teacher at the University of Chicago Lab School for the last 16 years. So God knows how many.
60 years of teaching.
Yeah. And not counting, my college, and, I've got an undergraduate degree, and like Crispien, I have 2 advanced degrees as well. So even as a student, and also the University of Chicago, I went through their liberal arts program for adults there that they have. And you go through a graduation, you get a little certificate of graduation or whatever they call it. And
So you've maintained being a student the entire time you've been a
yes,
teacher as well.
I can't. It's like in a negative way. It's like an addict with heroin or something like that. So, teaching, school, education. It's a habit. It's a habit for me. I can't. It electrifies me. It keeps me going. It's what I look forward to every single day. I never get tired of it.
Yeah, I find the same thing. I'm very comfortable when I'm a student in a building. You put me in front of the classroom, I'm comfortable, but I prefer to be the student. And I know we both talk about this all the time. The when you stop learning, you stop.
Yeah. This brings me to reading also, which is an important thing. From my family, from my parents, I gained a love of books, music, the arts, all people are equal. And in other words, they were models for me. And my father would always be reading books. We always had books in the house, magazines, newspapers. These were models. And even today, if there are parents listening or whatever and so forth, the most important thing you can do as your child is growing up is to read to him or her and have that model there, have the books there. That helps. That has helped me in a great deal in terms of being a teacher and in terms of being an educator as well. But my father belonged to the Doubleday Book Club. When the books would arrive, I would grab them first and read them before he would begin reading them and so on. So reading, I think, is also an important aspect, because if a student is going to be successful in school in general, what is it that he doesn't do that doesn't involve reading? You have to be a reader, and that's important.
So Charles, you've spoken a little bit about Farragut, but I'm curious if you can share more about the school environment in which you taught. How big a school was it, and what was the demographic makeup of the school, and what kind of neighborhood was it in?
All right, all good questions, and trying not to forget all aspects of them. It was your typical big, I hate to use inner city, it's a pejorious term, but it was a typical, let's say, marginalized.
Marginalized
It was
community.
a typical marginalized big school. 2,000, 3,000 students, something like that. They had to build a newer school in order to accommodate, because of the fact that there were so many students going to it. When I first started in the early 1960s, it was a predominantly African-American school. But then, unless you're local or regional and you're familiar with Harrison High School, also on the west side, which was a predominantly Latin school, Hispanic school. When they closed, the parents had no choices. They didn't have enough money to put them into a private parochial school. And unfortunately, Farragut had a reputation for gang problems. And for the educational program not being what it should be, and so forth and so on. And there was a great deal of hesitancy on the part of Hispanic parents to want to send their children to Farragut, but they had no choice. They had to do it.
When the neighborhood was transitioning and your school was transitioning from being a primarily African
I
American.
haven't covered all aspects of her question yet. What else? Oh, demographic. So demographically, it started out as being predominantly African American, and then around the 80s or going into the 90s, it transitioned to being a predominantly Hispanic school, with the Hispanic ethnic group being predominantly Mexican American. And when that happened, and I think you were talking about what happened in the school, and there was a great deal of unrest. I don't know if I'm right in this or not, but I believe there has been some history of racist attitudes towards some elements of the Mexican American community with the African American community. And Farragut, ironically, was in an area that was predominantly Hispanic. And then when the school began to become predominantly Hispanic, there were parents who wanted to see, rather than an African American principal, a Mexican principal. And of course, some of the things that they wanted were some of the things that African American students and parents wanted when it was a predominantly African American school. And there was a lot of tensions between the Mexican American students and the African American students. And there were some Puerto Rican students as well, but they were dark skinned. So as far as some of the Mexican American students were concerned, they were like African Americans already because of their darker skin. And so they were also lumped in with them as well. And so there was fights inside the school. There were fights outside of the school. There were students who brought guns into the school.
Early?
There were early on into the transition, or as the transition and the tensions were growing, yeah. There were even some shootings outside of the school. And of course, all of this also mirrored the gang warfare that was going on between Hispanic groups and African American groups. The Latin Kings was the major Hispanic group, I believe, and I forgot what the names of the predominantly black gangs were. And I even understand. Oh, really? Already?
I've been trying to drive you, but let's see. So,
Did I answer all aspects of the question?
Yeah, you can.
and you answered my next question too. So you led yourself right there. So how much time are we?
We have about 10 minutes.
Okay, about 10 minutes. All right, so I want to ask you this, and I think they're two of the most important events that happen in the neighborhood around Farragut when you're teaching there.
All right.
What was the school's reaction to the death of Fred Hampton,
Well,
the chairman of the Black Panther Party?
yeah, as among the African American students, there was recognition, first of all, who he was and so on. I don't know if this was the case with those who were not African American. This was just it was just another example as far as African American students was concerned of it, just another police assassination, another police killing.
Did it bring out anything in the students, any advocacy? Did they form any groups? Did they try and organize within the school?
That was going on throughout the 60s and into the 70s. I don't recall when Hampton was assassinated, but one of the field trips I did.
1969.
69, okay, yeah. One of the things we did when Dr. King moved in, by the way, I took classes of students out there to the house. After what happened to Fred Hampton, that house where he and his girlfriend, who was from Farragut, by the way, I think a Farragut graduate, and other people who were in there and so on, and the police shot from all angles, and so forth, and claimed that they were defending themselves and so on, which was not the case at all. But at any rate, I took another bunch of students there to the house, and you can see the bullet holes clearly from the outside. Very few from the inside, if any at all, but plenty from the outside going in.
And then one other event we have with the death of Dr. King, the neighborhood erupts in violence.
Yes.
And I've talked to some of your former students who've praised the school at protecting itself. How does Farragut kind of avoid this sweeping wave of violence and fire that comes through the neighborhood? How does the school remain intact?
During that time, we had, this was a predominantly African-American school then, that time. The president of the student council was he had his head on straight. He was a very responsible, empathetic individual, and he knew what was happening around us as far as what was going on in the other schools, and he didn't want to see this happen at Farragut. And so what he did was, because of the fact that many of the students, not just those that were part of the student government, but other students outside of that, who were aware of him and so on, had a great deal of respect. So on the day in which we came to school for half a day, and then it was being called because of everything that was going on, he peacefully led the student body outside of the school. No one attacked any of the teachers. No one set any trash cans on fire or did anything of the sort. Whereas, as I said before, in the other schools, Crane or the other nearby schools, things were up for grabs there.
Yeah, I was told that that it was a combination of the student president and the teachers who had built
Yes.
community, had built connections
Yes.
with the students that kept the school from.
Most especially the African American teachers that were there. There was one of them. Since he's died, I'm saying he's positive. He's positive and constructive. I don't see any reason why I shouldn't identify who he is, because he played a very important role in helping. He was like a father to a lot of the African American students and so on. He was called Brother Charles, and he and other African American teachers at that time along with the students, because again, when it was predominantly African American at that time, they had a great deal of respect for him and some of the other teachers and for the student president, and therefore all of that played a very important role in avoiding Farragut to go up for grabs.
So the fact that Farragut had created a learning community and everybody was kind of bound together is really what ends up
Yes,
protecting the
yes,
school during the
yes,
riots. Fantastic.
Although that wasn't true of some of the teachers there. They couldn't get out fast enough. They talked this liberal game and so forth, but then when things started to get hot and these demands were being made, you would go down to the Board of Education in downtown Chicago and you look up and see what schools are advertising for teachers that they need. They couldn't get out of there fast enough.
All right, since we're on our last bit of time here, I want to ask you something that's very key to your experience as an educator. You were one of the first teachers in Chicago Public Schools to teach African American history. Can you explain to me what that's like in the early 60s when you, as a white Jewish Chicagoan, is teaching Black history?
I wasn't the only one. Also, Noreen Baldy was the other one, the two of us. Again, I mentioned the reason why we ended up teaching it was because of the fact of the other teacher who was African American felt it should be part of the regular U.S. history and therefore didn't want to touch it, did not want to teach it. We immersed ourselves intellectually about African American history and so forth and so on. But obviously we did not have the experiential or the emotional experiences of what it meant to be called the N-word or be discriminated against or being beaten up because of the color of your skin or railroaded into jail or things of that sort. So what Noreen and I would do is we would share the information, the intellectual aspect of it, and we would bring in people from the community, from the neighborhood. Reverend Jesse Jackson, for example, was one of our guests several times at the school. And so we brought in people who would make up for that lack of experience that we had. Diane was talking about the fact of giving individual examples. So very quickly, one day, one of the African-American students asked me, why are you talking, telling us about what white people do and so forth, all these bad things when you're white yourself? I told him, I'm a historian. What happened, happened. I'm not making anything up. I'm not giving fake news or anything of that sort. This is what happened, and we're not going to be able to solve these problems that led to these things happening if we don't immerse ourselves in it to try and understand it and learn about it. The reason why things that are happening in Florida and in the libraries and so forth is because it's another attempt to not want the students in general to know the real history of this country, not the founding fathers mythology and all this other stuff that students have been taught year in and year out.
All right, and now we're going to wrap this up. And this is the question that since I kind of introduced you to Belle, I'd like you to talk to me.
Wait.
Just come a little closer to the mic.
Sorry, backed up too far. Since I introduced you to Belle, and I know how much you've come to love Bell Hook's writing, what, as an educator today, where you are today, how much of an influence and how much has she changed some of your perspectives from
What's the name of the book about the
Teaching to Transgress?
Yeah, Teaching to Transgress. That book had a real impact on me. Her book and Jonathan Kozol's books too. Death at an Early Age, the very first book he published about what really went on in the inner city schools in Boston, where he just started teaching there and so on. Oh, and I guess if you're going to talk again about models for wanting to become a teacher, we can add these two as well. I'm reading a lot of Bell Hooks that I can get my hands on. The book that I currently finished, I gave to you, Love.
On Love, yes.
Yeah, on Love it's an excellent book. It's too bad she's no longer with us now. Yeah. And anything that Jonathan Kozol has written too gives a lot of insight in terms of what education should be, not what it ends up being.
And so, since the topic of this is going on city education and educational equity, did you see any positive changes toward educational equity to the African American community and then later the Latino community here in town? Did you notice any positive changes, or was it just this continuous string of negative changes happening within the education system?
No, I know this is going to sound very self-righteous, but I'll say it. I think, I don't know what was happening in other classrooms and so forth, but I think year in and year out at Farragut, in terms of the things that I was doing, I think that would be what was happening with them. Now, what was happening in general in the school, I don't know. There were a lot of individual examples and things that did happen that certainly was very positive in terms of the education that was going on at Farragut.
But it was mostly bottom up from the teachers, not from the administrators or from the overall CPS?
It was from teachers, yes. We've had principals there. We had one principal, he would go around the school glad-handing people as if he was running for political office, which he was, but in a higher educational position other than being principal of Farragut and so on. I don't think we've ever had a principal in all the years that I was there that I can think of that really was a master or an expert or really emphasized education and educational methodology and how students should be taught, in which education was the main aspect. It usually would be what the board wants, what the administration wants, things dealing with discipline and things of that sort, but very little. We've had very few educational leaders, and I don't think we ever have had a good educational leader as principal of that school. Now, that may have changed since I left. I don't know.
So, and to wrap this up, when you're thinking on equity and educational opportunity right now, and with all of your experience as a teacher and your education as a teacher, what do you think are the most important things we can do looking forward? I know we've spent most of this interview looking backward, but what can we do from here forward to help reach a more equitable education system within the city of Chicago and wider?
First of all, to do something about the wide gaps between the marginalized schools and the so-called better schools.
Yeah, like how we only have librarians in the college track schools. Most Chicago public school students don't know what the inside of a library is like.
And I would like to see, in talking about educational leadership, I think the best type of education that should go on in the school, like Farragut or any other school like it, besides lessening the wide gap there between these two different types of schools, is to adopt progressive educational methodology and to adopt Dewey's experiential learning by doing. It shouldn't not only be for a private school like the University of Chicago Lab School. It should be something that should be going on in all of the schools in this particular city. And that the schools should have the same ability to get the type of resources, the type of caring teachers, the type of materials, the type of educational experiences and so forth that are taken for granted by the lab school in Hyde Park, or by any of the, Lincoln Park High School, another example, in probably the richest area of the city, maybe, in terms of property and salaries and stuff.
I remember a story you told me about bringing a group of students from Farragut on a field trip to Lincoln Park High School. And I think that story shows the disparity of education between the two more than any. So do we have enough time?
Yeah.
Can you run over what it was like to bring students from Farragut to Lincoln Park?
I was involved in a particular program where we had student school exchanges. And so I took a group of students from Farragut to Lincoln Park High School. And Lincoln Park High School came to Farragut Career Academy High School. It was Farragut High School before that. But because we never, we won't get into that side story, or I'm going to lose the time. All right, so the students from Lincoln Park High School were surprised by the lack of things, or, they took a lot of the things that happened at Lincoln Park for granted. And then they heard, when we got together in group sessions and so on, they heard about problems that the Farragut students were talking about in terms of crimes and gangs and things of that sort. And then when we went to Lincoln Park High School and did the same thing, what were the problems that Lincoln Park High School students were talking about? Parking. Their SUVs were too big, to park in a particular space and so on. Had nothing to do with gangs, had nothing to do with lack of resources, had nothing to do with poverty or any of that other stuff. That was the big issue.
And while your students at Farragut are having trouble with gangs and even in the classroom having trouble with textbooks, the library shut down, and additional resource shortages, you take them to a school. How did the students at Lincoln Park react when they came to visit?
They were just surprised. They had no idea of this world at all, of this type of educational situation at all. Again,
we're in bubbles.
One of the things you want to do is you want to broaden out students' experiences and so forth. And it's not just inner city students that may be living in a particular type of restricted environment and so on. Also, the so-called better off students suffer from the same type of thing. So they take it for granted that what they have at Lincoln Park is what the students would have at Farragut High School. They were surprised when it didn't happen.
That's been my experience teaching at the lab school as well, that the students at lab school are they have no understanding of what it is like in the wider world.
Because they live in that the protective bubble.
Yes.
And they don't get the real story about what's really happening in history or anything else for that matter.
So as we wrap this up, you want to say anything, or are we all set? Anything?
I just want to say that there are probably, all right, I'll say this. I just want to say that there are probably people out there, and I know I've ran into them from time to time, who tell me, why are you teaching there? And how you deal with this and how you deal with that and so forth. And it's certainly a struggle and it's hard. And certainly I had a lot of sleepless nights and things of that sort. But I will say this as a final statement. Despite everything, despite the gang warfare, despite the lack of resources, despite the lack of experiences, despite all the negative things that were going on that were interfering in the education of the students that were there at that particular school, and despite the fact that there were situations there which I thought, well, I'll be lucky if I get home alive, or things of that sort, despite all of that, I would not give up any of those experiences for anything in the world. They enriched my life. I would have been a poor type of individual or person today if I had never gone through any of those experiences during my 40 plus some years at Farragut. And even to some extent with my 16 years at the lab school, because there are students there, just because they're going there does not necessarily mean they don't suffer from the same type of problems and so on. And there are also African-American students who are there as well. But I would never give any of this up at all. If I had to do it all over again, I'd do it.